Joining us now is Professor Emeritus from MIT, Theodore Postol. Ted, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
And so to set up this conversation, can you give us a kind of quick run through of your career, how you wound up both at the Pentagon and also doing your academic work?
Well, through a series of accidents, I was actually doing basic science, and I was increasingly concerned and interested in the arms race. This was in the 80s when the arms race was just completely out of control. And I wound up through a series of accidents and a very close friend of mine in Washington, going to the Office of Technology Assessment, where I worked on a study of the MX missile, which was the big game in town at the time, in fact, international game. And I came to the attention of the U.S. Navy because of some of the work I was doing with them as an outside analyst. And I was offered a position as a science and policy advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations. And of course, that was a great opportunity, so I took it. And I wound up, very quickly in the belly of the beast, worked a few years with the chief, saw quite a lot, which I must say educated me to a level that maybe I shouldn't have at this point, because you see a combination of the most capable and the most incapable and opportunistic people. You see the spread, very, very good and very, very bad people. And it gave me, I think, an extremely refined understanding of how these bureaucracies work. And of course, I took the opportunity to, I spent many nights in a cage reading classified documents to learn as much as I could about the weapon systems that that I was supposed to be advising on, and that gave me a baseline that I've been able to build on for decades. So it's just a series of accidents.
Yeah, and I think baseline is definitely being humble there. You're, I think, one of the foremost experts on the issue we're talking about here. We could start with kind of E2 here. This is a Washington Post article headline, kind of concerning headline. U.S. concerned about Ukraine strikes on Russian nuclear radar stations. So walk us through why the U.S. is concerned about this and why we ought to be concerned about this as well. What is Ukraine doing here?
Well, the U.S. should be concerned about this, and unfortunately, I think the U.S. has to take responsibility for this, because these radar stations are critical to the early warning systems of Russia. And Russia, unlike us, does not have satellites in space that are capable of seeing the whole Earth from space. We have this kind of capability. So if they lose a radar, they have no way of knowing what's coming at them from that direction. Whereas if we lose a radar, we just simply go to our satellites and look down and we say, oh yeah, we can see nothing is happening there. Now, given the high state of tension between Russia and the United States at this time, I think it's extraordinarily dangerous to tamper with anything that has anything to do with Russia's early warning capabilities, because they are going to be more alert at this time because of concerns about nuclear weapon use from the United States. Now, Americans tend to have the attitude, oh, we would never strike them first. It's a common reaction. But I can assure you that they don't believe this about us. And in fact, if you look at American nuclear weapon systems and the kinds of things we are doing even now, it creates the appearance. I want to underscore, it creates an appearance, because I don't think people realize, what the meaning of what they're doing is. But to a well-informed technical analyst on the Russian side, it looks like the United States is preparing to fight and win a nuclear war with Russia. Now, of course, fighting and winning a nuclear war is ridiculous. The only way you win a nuclear war is by a definition. The definition is ridiculous. It's like at the end of this exchange, where both of our countries and civilization is destroyed, we have some margin of a slightly larger number of nuclear weapons left in our arsenal than the adversary. Well, that's totally ridiculous. That's like saying, well, we'll have more fingernails on our body when our head is blown off. So fighting and winning a nuclear war is just absolutely, this is not a matter of opinion, absolutely analytically ridiculous. But these kinds of doctrines have developed in the United States and in Russia too, because there was a long time where people did not fully understand how catastrophic large-scale use of nuclear weapons would be. From my point of view, this is so obvious that an infant would understand it. But unfortunately, in the world of military doctrine, and let me be clear here, I'm not talking about just the military people. I'm talking about civilian political scientists in the Pentagon. They invent these magical worlds where you can use nuclear weapons with very limited consequences. And the physics, I want to understand, the physics of this shows that that's not true. Forget about all the other complexities, like no one would know what was going on if a nuclear weapon was used. Let's just reflect back on what happened when the World Trade Center was hit. The president had no idea what was going on. The US government couldn't inform him because they had no idea what was going on. Now imagine you have hundreds, if not thousands, of events on a much larger scale simultaneously going on. Who is going to know what's happening? And of course, all kinds of reactions and counter reactions could be happening automatically. And every simulation that's worth looking at indicates that you would have a rapid escalation to a general nuclear war if nuclear weapons start to get used. So we need to do everything, absolutely everything, to keep our hands off the Russian systems. Because if they attack us by accident, it's going to be the end of everyone. So this is not like poking the bear to see what he's going to do. This is really dangerous.
And so as you're watching all of this play out, and we can put the first element up on the screen, this is what happened in Crimea recently. This is a VO of, obviously, munitions hitting a beach in Crimea. And control room, you can go ahead and put E3 up after that finishes playing. This is Russia blaming the United States for what they call the barbaric Ukrainian attack on Crimea. Obviously, there's been an escalation in recent days in this war. So, Ted, as you're watching this play out, how do you feel, based on all the context you just gave us, the administration is handling the threat of potential nuclear conflict? Do you feel good about the way the administration is?
Go
ahead.
I'm tremendously disturbed by the way the administration is handling this. It's as if the administration is poking the Russians, trying to provoke them to do something very dangerous. Now, I don't want to sound like a Putin lover, but I have to say that looking at Putin very clear-eyed, not all this silly demonization of him, but just looking carefully at his history and what he does and what he says he's going to do and how he follows up, it is very clear that Mr. Putin is an extremely stable, strategic thinker. And I do not believe he is going to do anything rash in response to this. He's not going to be provoked. But it appears that the United States is trying to provoke him to do something silly. Oh, no, it's not silly. Extraordinarily dangerous and lethal. And I do not think he will do this, but I think he will strike back, and it will cost American lives in the end. He's made it clear just the other day that he considers this a serious war crime. Incidentally, I haven't seen, it looks to me more like an accident, but that's another discussion. But he considers it a war crime, and the Russians in general are absolutely outraged. We should also keep in mind that the Russians believe, right or wrong, that this horrifying Crocus City attack in Moscow, where all these innocent people were murdered by these people who appear to be associated with ISIS. And also, according to the Russians, they believe that the Ukrainians were involved in one way or another supporting the ISIS attack. Given that the Russians have this mindset, independent of whether or not this is correct, they are going to be acting on it. And instead of doing things to reduce the the belief among the Russians by either providing them with information, intelligence, or apologizing, or making some statements that indicate we do not support this kind of thing, we have just stuck our thumb in the eyes of the Russians at every opportunity. And this is not good diplomacy. We have this war. We want to win the war. Incidentally, we're not winning it. We are losing it catastrophically, and the American press is not covering this. Right now, the Russians could end this war in weeks if they chose to take the casualties. Right now, what they are doing is minimizing their casualties while they are destroying Ukrainian forces at the rate of nearly 2,000 casualties a day. That's like 40,000, 45,000 casualties a month. That is the strategy of the Russians at this time. That's why we're not seeing great gains in territory, because their strategy is to destroy the Ukrainian army, and then when the army is sufficiently depleted, then sweep in and take over everything. They have 300,000 troops, fully armed, fully trained, and fully equipped, not involved in the fighting at this point, that they can call in anytime they choose. The problem they have, or if you want to call it a problem, is they don't want to take the extra casualties associated with a big offensive action against a capable army. So the first part of their strategy is to destroy the capability of the army they're facing, and then unleash the backup forces, the reserve forces, on the remaining army. This is a bad situation, and the American press has not reported it accurately. I follow this every day. There's a lot of international coverage of this from organizations that every time you check what they said and what has actually been verified, they're accurate. So it's clear to me that we have that I have, others do too, have an accurate picture of the situation in Ukraine. We have lost already. Unless the Russians decide.
I'm sorry. I was just saying,
unless the Russians.
Go ahead.
Well, the point here is that if we have already lost, why aren't we talking to the Russians to see what kind of ceasefire we can get? Mm-hmm. Instead, we talk about victory. There is no victory. I'm not saying this because I'm, some kind of defeatist. I'm saying this because the facts are clear. And all that is happening right now is the Russians are deepening their commitment, their resolve to finish this thing in a way that meets their perceived security objectives. And their perceived security objective is to keep NATO out of Ukraine. And what they will do, what they are poised to do and can do at any time, except that they don't want to take the casualties at the moment because they have a strategy that's working. What they will do is they will take all of Ukraine, of the Black Sea coast. They will probably take up to Kiev, the land there. They may take the main body of what we call Western Ukraine, but I don't think they want to do that because the Western Ukrainians are deeply hostile to the Russians. But what they can do is they can then strangle Ukraine, because the Black Sea coast is the only way that Ukraine can take these tremendous resources they have in grain and sell them to the world. So they can just stop Ukraine from being an economically viable enterprise. So I don't have any idea what they will do, but why do we want to play this game? And this is an American decision at this point, and it's the only decision we have. All this fiction, which I believe is designed to prevent the average American from understanding that the war in Ukraine is lost and that this could have implications for the November election. That's what's going on here.
And if you're, I was just saying, if you're able to come to that assessment, you can imagine that the Ukrainian leadership, understands the current military strategy of Russia and the current military situation they're in, which would lend, either towards some type of impulse for, a negotiated solution to this, or something desperate. And it seems like what we're seeing in the last several days and weeks is desperation. Yesterday, there was another strike on a Russian kind of radar facility. My understanding from our conversation that you and I had yesterday is that is not an early, that was not necessarily an early
that's
warning.
A command center for.
So what? Can you talk about these latest strikes and how those play in?
Well, the strikes on the Russian, yesterday's strike was on a radar system that is designed for communications to space systems that are extremely deep in space. It's on a southern latitude. It's not associated with the early warning system, very fortunately. But it's simply a provocation, but not something that is going to raise the alert status of the Russian nuclear forces. The Russians have a big space program. They have probes they send to the moon, to Mars, Venus, and these things are very, very far away in space. And they have these gigantic antennas that focus radio signals on those specific objects so they can communicate signals to them and get information back. So that's what that particular facility was.
Would there be any military value in taking out one of those deep space facilities?
No, it would be just doing damage to their civil space program, their science space program. It would just be an irritant. I mean, in terms of, there's no military utility to that attack. It's an attack that says, we want to hurt you. Just like, unfortunately, our Secretary of Defense said at one time, he said, well, we want to do strategic damage to Russia. He actually said that. So when someone in his position says something like that, how would you miss it if you were Russian? When Anthony Blinken tells Sergei Lavrov, that, well, we reserve the right to put nuclear ballistic missiles in Ukraine. What does he think Lavrov is thinking? It would be like telling John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis that we reserve the right to put nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in Cuba. So you Americans don't like it? Tough luck. I mean, I don't understand what this administration thinks it's doing. It's just, it's incomprehensible to me.
The point about the election is interesting.
I'm sorry?
The point about the election is interesting, that the administration may be thinking, well, this is off the front pages for now. So if we can keep it off the front pages through November, then maybe that reduces the risk to the electoral calculus. I
think that's clearly what's going on. I don't know, but if I look at the body language, so to speak, absolutely what's going on. They're in a panic because they understand, or should understand. If they don't understand, God help us all. They are in a panic because they know that the whole situation in Ukraine could collapse at any time. Ukrainian units are refusing to follow orders in many cases now. We have reports of that. Even the other day, this Azov unit, which is a bunch of neo-Nazis, these guys are ultra-nationalists. They're followers of this guy, Stepan Bandera. Bandera was the guy who fostered a political movement that resulted in the murder of 150,000 Polish people during the World War II, and also the population of SS Gestapo units with Ukrainian volunteers. That's the Ukraine that they don't want to.
Even that unit is facing trouble.
It's what they did is there was a general in charge of the area where they were assigned. That was it's not clear what was happening, but I could take a very good, well-informed guess. They were probably ordering attacks on counterattacks on Russian units. Now, these counterattacks cause extraordinary levels of casualties among the Ukrainians. And the reason for this is that the Russians now have complete control of the air. So this is what the Americans have typically in a war. Mm-hmm. We have complete control of the air, but the Russians have it here. And they also have 10-to-1 artillery firing capability, 10-to-1. So when you get out of your foxhole and go running at the enemy, they slaughter you. And this is exactly the kind of combat strategy the Ukraine has been involved in for the last couple of years. A very high percentage of the losses that the Ukrainians have been suffering are due to these hopeless attacks. Rather than falling back and trying to defend positions and letting the Russians try to take those positions, they just run into the fire of the Russians. And it's very clear that Putin does not want a large number of Russian casualties. It's very hard to know what's actually happening. So this is a guess. I want to be clear, this is a guess. But my guess is that the casualties being taken by the Ukrainians are 5-to-1. Mm-hmm. So when you hear about 1,500 casualties being taken, which is sort of the average during the day, 1,500 to 2,000 right now, you're talking about 300 or 350 or 400 casualties on the part of the Russians. So this is a massacre. And, my own view of this is I'm terribly upset about it because from my point of view, you can call me whatever you want, but I just see innocent people on both sides. These Russian soldiers are no more guilty than these Ukrainian soldiers who have been forced into combat. And they're murdering each other for no reason because Ukraine is lost. And the political decision makers are sitting in the White House. In this case, they are the ones because they have these Stepan Bandera extremists in charge in Ukraine. The White House is trying to sustain the appearance with the help, unfortunately, of the American press, which has not done a very good job, that this war is still open to a potential positive end for the United States. It's actually over. And I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I was actually, that's a big picture question. I'm so curious, as you've worked in the space for decades, just thinking about what's happening at the White House as you just outlined it, how does this moment compare to previous moments of potential escalation to the point where the threat of nuclear conflict, maybe even in recent memory? Obviously, you mentioned earlier your history in the space in the 1980s, but Maybe even over the course of the last 10, 20 years, has there been a moment as precarious as this? Is it always as precarious as this? How does this compare?
Well, the problem is there could be a completely unforeseen series of accidents. Let me give you an example. We know this happened. We know this happened. In fact, I have studied this in great detail and have written about it. We know that in 1996, it was Yeltsin, Clinton, and we were in this phase where both Russia and the United States were hoping to have a wholly new relationship. We botched it, in my view, but that's another discussion. But people were not at each other at all, and there was a a sounding rocket, a rocket that's launched vertically by scientists, pointy-headed people like me who were just trying to understand, take measurements in the ionosphere, upper ionosphere. And they launched this rocket in a near vertical trajectory, slightly tipped over away from Russia, but it went to a very high altitude, 11,000 kilometers, and it was taking measurements of the ionosphere. Well, the problem with this rocket was that its powered flight trajectory had the appearance of a Trident ballistic missile going to a near vertical trajectory. Now, most people would say, why does that matter? Well, this could be the first part of a nuclear attack where you detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitude, and it creates sort of a radar absorbing layer in the atmosphere. So it's like you took a blanket and threw it over the radar. Or if you think of yourself as someone who's watching, and I throw a blanket over your head. So now you can't see anything. And this kind of precursor attack is exactly something that both sides, Russia and the United States, planned for in their own nuclear war retaliation findings, planning. Now, in 1996, you had in fact, I've spoken with the guy who was in charge. His name is Victor Yeltsin. He was the guy in charge of the strategic rocket forces at the time. And he's a very sober, extremely well-educated, competent man. And he sat there watching this experiment, which he had no idea whether or not it was a nuclear weapon, rise to its maximum altitude. And the moment it started to fall back to the Earth, he called off the alert because he knew that whatever it was, he didn't know what it was, but he knew it was not a precursor nuclear attack. Now, if we had big fighting going on in Ukraine at the time, and the United States and Russia maybe were using tactical nuclear weapons against each other, or very serious escalation, NATO troops were injected, the French troops that Macron wants to put into Ukraine, they're being slaughtered by the Russians, which of course will happen if those troops are there. And and the Russians could think they were under attack. Now, I think they are very cautious. So I don't want to overstate this. The Russians are very cautious. They're very competent. They're very professional. They understand that if they accidentally attack the United States, it's the end of their country too. So I don't want to overstate this, but the question I would ask you to consider is, do you think them having this state of mind at that time without a complete knowledge of what's going on is a good thing for the United States? So I don't want to be one of these people, the sky is falling. But when the consequences are literally the end of civilization and, potentially the end of human existence, that is less clear, but certainly the end of civilization as we know it, why would you want to push the buttons on this? I don't understand. I'm baffled. And part of the reason may be that the people in the White House are not informed. And that's been my experience, incidentally. I've talked to people over decades from time to time in White House positions, and they don't have a clue. Because these people are political. And I'm not saying this to attack them. Their concern is, how do I get reelected, and how do I keep the American public from knowing my dark secret, my screw up on something. And that's why you see all this hate mongering for Putin. Putin is our adversary. There's no question that he doesn't mean good things for us. But he's not Adolf Hitler. I mean, this is ridiculous. He's a very capable guy who has jujitsu'd us in so many circumstances. These guys don't want the American people to figure out how clever he has been and how everything we have done to try to screw up the Russians has backfired on us, because the Russians have been clever in responding. So what do? You can't explain this. You don't want to explain this to your electorate. You're trying to get reelected. So they say, oh, it's this guy Putin. He's so terrible. He's such a terrible. Now, I'm not trying to say that I would want to run against Putin in an election in Russia. He'd kill me. But Mohammed bin Salman is not our wonderful bosom buddy either. These countries have their own political systems, and when you recognize what's going on in those systems, doesn't mean you approve of them, and it doesn't mean you think it's good. It's just understanding the facts of the world. And this guy Putin, is unbelievably thoughtful, deep thinking, and strategic in his thinking. And he just said just yesterday that he's going to find a way to pay us back for what he sees as this attack. And let me tell you, he doesn't bluff. He doesn't bluff. I have watched him with extreme care. And when he says something, I don't say, oh, he's a monster, blah, blah. I take it at its word, and I ask myself, what does this guy mean? And we have had decades of people who claim to be experts on Russia feeding us nonsense about what a monster this man is. He's not a nice person. You wouldn't want him as your close personal friend. But that is different from portraying him as this monster that goes around murdering people whenever he has the notion. It's not the case at all. You just have to look at the facts. And so we have these people who in one way or another are getting funding from the U.S. government or feel an alliance to the U.S. government, who have painted this portrait that is totally bizarre. I mean, why don't we do that with other, he's not Hitler. I mean, Hitler was
underestimating your adversary usually doesn't end well.
Well, it's not simply underestimating; it's portraying your adversary in a way that hides your bad decisions that have backfired on you. Mm-hmm. So it's what I consider a politically motivated strategy.
Well, Theodore Postol, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I hope it's been helpful.
Very helpful.
Very helpful indeed.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.